आ गया। यूट्यूब का लिंक देखिए। हाँ दादा। हाँ हाँ। हाँ वाइब्रेट कर। अब बात कहाँ से करूँगा? अच्छा। हाँ।
Radha, please switch off your camera. Radha, fourth semester, please switch off your camera. Let me see you.
तो सुनिए, उसमें कुछ बोलेंगे सर, उसमें जाइए। मीट में। और आप व्हाट्सअप कीजिएगा। हाँ।
Hello, Priyanka. Hello, Priyanka. Honor sir has joined. Okay.
Yes, sir.
So we will start it by within 5 minutes. Yes.
Yes, sir. So the principal sir will not be joining today.
No, principal sir will not be joining today.
Okay, sir.
प्रियंका मैम,
Yes, sir.
आप शुरू कर सकते हैं।
हाँ, ठीक है।
No, at 11 o'clock. Okay.
Yes, sir. 1 minute.
2 or 4 minutes more, 3 minutes more. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, you can start, Priyanka. You can start the proceedings.
Yes, sir. A very good morning to all. We are delighted to welcome you to the second day of the lecture series after an enthralling session yesterday. I would now request everyone to please switch off your mics and cameras, and the students, you already know, if you have questions after the lecture, you can ask your questions by typing in the chat box and your questions will be taken from there later. Uh, I would like to welcome our IQAC coordinator, Dr. Arnav Ball, our head of the Department of Political Science, Dr. Vikas Ranjan Dev, the speakers, Mr. Aditya Gising and Ms. Gazala Fareedi, esteemed colleagues, and all my students. I would now request our IQAC coordinator to inaugurate the lecture by saying a few words.
Thank you, Priyanka. On behalf of IQAC, I welcome you all. And as you know, that IQAC is always engaged in collaborating with programs which actually could be of help to the students primarily. And this program is one of it. Here, the 2-day session that have been kept by the department for the benefit of the students is very interesting one, because the topics, as I have found yesterday also, and the topic is for today also, are so relevant that students should be aware about the happenings during this COVID-19 era, and to look into these things from various perspectives. Another factor is very encouraging for me as a coordinator, that I've always seen that in the political science department, all the students are very responsive. I mean, 69 present, I'm finding yesterday, I think it was 76. So that's a great achievement on the part of the department and also on the part of the students. So thank you to the HOD and all the teachers, and also my thanks to the students. And that is what you should be. You should attend all the programs that have been so meticulously designed by your department for your benefit only. And believe me that from now onwards, if you are not having that kind of consciousness about what is happening in and around you, you will not be in a very good state in future. And looking at the situations in and around us, we have to be much more alert. I am not going to say anything about the topic, but I must share my sense of contentment regarding the choice of topics because yesterday it was regarding Look East, I believe it was. Yeah, Look East, Act East. And today it is diplomacy and its evolution in the era of COVID-19. So now Gazala madam will be talking on that. So you will hear from madam, but as a layman, we all understand the meaning of diplomacy. The diplomacy is something which is always there, ingrained in our daily life. And COVID-19 has again given us an opportunity to look into this whole notion of diplomacy from multiple perspectives. As you can see that we always consider diplomacy as a word which should be used in relation to international relations of a country with other countries, the position of one country in the global map, how it is maintaining its interest by keeping a good relation with its neighbors. These are fine. But in COVID-19, we are also finding some new twists and turns in this whole process of diplomatic maneuvering. And medical diplomacy is another thing that is coming and that is upcoming and that is a thing which was unheard of in common perception. And how the whole notion of the disease has been used by multiple channels and multiple agencies to get the things done. That is quite interesting, at least for me. The whole notion of disease and the politics regarding the disease, the politics regarding the maintenance of the disease. You students may not understand nuances of these things now, but one day will come when you will understand that politics and diplomacy, these are all going to capture every aspect of our life. So don't always believe when you are talking about COVID warriors that you are actually celebrating the warriors. You have to understand what is the mission behind that, what is the politics behind that. When you are thinking that India government is supplying some medicines to America, what is the real notion about it? And relate it to the discussions that you had yesterday, the Look East, as Sir was rightly pointing out yesterday, if I remember, in the initial 10 minutes, that that we are actually shifting our focus to America, to Israel, leaving aside the neighbors. And you see what happened to India, it's in a soup now. With all the countries in the neighborhood, we are not in good terms. Now, if you are going to relate it to the whole notion of diplomacy and relating it to the COVID-19 situation, you will find a historical perspective is working there. Throughout the history, you will always see that disease has always been a bone of contention for all the nations. Many sorts of diplomacies are there. It has opened a Pandora's box in Indian social structure. To deal with these things is the need of the hour. So this is quite interesting, and that is why I have said that don't consider today's lecture as separate entity, but try to relate both these things together and to create a perspective as a whole of what you mean by this whole notion of diplomacy, what you mean by this whole notion of international relations, and where India stands. Don't believe what media is generating. Don't accept things uncritically. Try to look into that and try to create your own perspective. And if you can really have that much idea in the initial stage when you are students, I'm sure when you are going to pass out and go to other institutions, you will be a person with clarity of thoughts and clarity of ideas with a confidence that is rare in others to find. I wish every success of the program, and I believe that political science students with 72 now, quite encouraging, will be marching ahead in comparison to other departments so far expression of their interest in all the matters of the department is concerned. Thank you all, and thank you to the head of the department, Gazala, and also to my dear colleagues. Thank you. I declare the program open.
Thank you so much, sir. I would now request Dr. Tirthankar Chakravarti, an assistant professor of the Department of Political Science, Registered Mahavidyalaya, to address the House.
Thank you, Priyanka. A very good morning to all. সবার যাতে সুবিধা হয় বোঝার জন্য আমি চেষ্টা করব একটা মিক্সচার लैंग्वेज यूज करते हैं क्षेत्र। तो सबसे पहले तो मैं इस गूगल मीट की पृष्ठ से डिप्लोमेसी के विषय पर बात रखने के लिए मेरे विचारों को व्यक्त करने के लिए मैं आभार प्रकट करता हूँ डिपार्टमेंट ऑफ पॉलिटिकल साइंस और खासकर डिपार्टमेंट की हेड श्री विकास रंजन देव सर कि मुझे ये मौका दिया गया और मैं ईश्वर से ये प्रार्थना करता हूँ अब जहाँ भी होंगे सब स्वस्थ रहेंगे और केंद्र सरकार और राज्य सरकार द्वारा दिए गए स्वास्थ्य विधि को मानते हुए खुद को और सभी को संक्रमण से रोकेंगे बचाने के लिए। जो विषय पे बताने के लिए यहाँ पर हमें रखा गया है सामने, दैट इज द डिप्लोमेसी या कूटनीति जिसे कहा जाता है हिंदी और बंगाली में। It is one of those intense ambiguous terms in my thinking that can have different meaning depending upon users and users. We can begin to make sense of it in relation to two major perspectives on world politics that might be labeled macro or micro perspective. Yet many times we find that the term diplomacy is used too loosely that appears to be synonymous with world politics or foreign policy as a whole. Similarly, as a link between international relations and international theory, often referred to as diplomatic history. But uses of the term in such general ways are potentially misleading us, but at least they alert us to the fact that diplomacy is central both to an understanding of global system of world politics and to foreign policies of state and other actors on the international stage. Thus, from macro perspective, it refers to a process of communication that is central to the working of the global system. In this case, if world politics is characterized simply by the tension between conflict and cooperation, diplomacy together with war can be said to represent its defining institution. For example, if I take the example here, if conflict and cooperation are placed at two ends of a spectrum, it can be located at the cooperation end, representing form of interaction that focuses on the resolution of conflict by dialogue and negotiation. Alternatively, from the micro perspective of international actors like states, understanding of diplomacy provides revealing insights into the behavior of the actors themselves in the global system. From this point of view, however, diplomacy can be identified as a policy instrument rather than a global process. Nevertheless, reviewing its long and colorful presence, counting its days of initiation, diplomacy has passed through several fascinating cards, from traditional diplomacy to new diplomacy, Cold War diplomacy to post-Cold War diplomacy, popularly known as the developmental democracy, focusing on the interest of the third world countries to the global or multilateral democracy after the beginning of globalization. And eventually, in all the cases, the SPA, that is the structure, the process, and the agenda, is the same, and functioning with its contextual priorities. In fact, even in this state of condition, the position of its functioning or importance will never be changed. Though the application path definitely has altered in facing SARS-CoV-2, commonly known as novel coronavirus. Thus, maybe we are now entering into phase of new normal diplomacy after the facing new challenges of COVID-19 pandemic. And I am also interested to get new aspect about diplomacy from our honorable speaker. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We will now be moving ahead to our speaker, Ms. Gazala Fareedi. She is an assistant professor in Southfield College, Department of Political Science, North Bengal University. She has submitted her PhD thesis in 2019 from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and she will be speaking on the topic diplomacy and its evolution in the era of COVID-19. Thank you. Gazala?
Thank you so much, Priyanka, and very good morning from my side to everyone present here, specifically Dr. Arnab Ball, Professor Dept, Dr. Chakravarti, and my dear friend Priyanka, and most importantly, dear students. And I am very eager to interact with you all. And I request that whatever questions you might have during the lecture, if you are having any problem understanding any specific concept, you can please write it in the chat box also. And so as already has been stated, the topic of my presentation is diplomacy and its evolution in the COVID era. So I have a PPT presentation, which I will just be sharing right now. Is it visible? Yes, it's visible. Hello? Yeah, it's visible. Okay. So the lecture will be divided into the following categories. First is that we'll be defining diplomacy. We'll be looking at what is the meaning of the term, and as Dr. Chakravarti has already mentioned when he gave the introduction, that it is a essentially contested terminology, as all political science concepts are. So although it is essentially contested, but we will try and define, give a simplified definition of the word diplomacy and what it means firstly. Then we'll go into looking at how old is this institution of diplomacy, what was its origin. After that, we'll be coming over to looking at a brief overview of its evolution, how it has changed over the years, what was the context, what were the political entities, and what has forced diplomacy to change as an institution. And then we'll go on to one of the major revolutions that took place that led to a lot of changes in the institution of diplomacy, and that is the information and communications technology revolution, and how it led to new emerging types of diplomacy. In the theory of diplomacy, after the ICT revolution, you have new terms in diplomacy that come up. Finally, we will go into COVID-19 and how it has become a watershed for all of us in all facets of our life, and what is its impact on diplomatic practice. And finally, we will come to the conclusion. So going into the first subsection, the meaning of the term diplomacy. Now, and we need to look at the meaning before we go on to look at what is the evolution, what has been the evolution and what diplomacy, of diplomacy. So simply put, like, Kutniti, as Dr. Chakravarti also mentioned in Hindi and Bengali, Kutniti. So uska matlab kya hota hai? Basically, it means that, very simply, that it means peaceful conduct of relations among political entities. Now, in this definition, in the first slide, the first point, if you look at it, two important phrases are there. And the two phrases are peaceful relations, first phase, and second phase is political entities. So peaceful relations and political entities. That means that the ultimate objective of diplomacy is to maintain peaceful relations. And peace is the foundation on which all other national interests can be fulfilled. Like, what can be our national interest? Better economy, growing GDP, better human development index everywhere, better development, So all these national interests can be fulfilled only when we have peace. All these cannot be fulfilled when we are at a war with some other country. So the first objective of diplomacy is to maintain peaceful relations so that these national interests can be fulfilled. The other term here is political entity. So when political entities are trying to maintain peaceful relations, that is what is known as diplomacy. Now, political entities in this case is mainly what we are referring to is the states, the state system, because we are living in the nation state system, where we have around, around 192 plus countries in the world right now. So a relationship between these countries, mainly, it means that predominantly but does not mean that other type of political entities do not conduct their own international diplomacy. Other international organizations like intergovernmental organizations like United Nations or the European Union, or even international non-governmental organizations like the Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch or Greenpeace, they also have their own form of diplomacy at the international level. So the definition is this: when these various types of political entities are conducting negotiations and communications to maintain peaceful relations to fulfill the national interest of all these groups, or the interest of all these groups, that is the meaning of diplomacy, simply put. Okay, now although we have simplified the definition, but there are two definitions that I've written in the slide. First is by Harold Nicolson, and Harold Nicolson was a British diplomat and a writer, and he has written this very famous book called Diplomacy, and where he defines diplomacy as management of international relations by negotiation, the method by which these relations are adjusted and managed by ambassadors and envoys. So here the important word is negotiation, because negotiation entails communication, it entails dialogue. Okay, so this is the definition by Harold Nicolson. Then we come to Nirupama Rao's definition, and as you all know, was India's former Foreign Secretary, and who defines diplomacy as: diplomacy is a fine art, heir to centuries of epochal deal-making, system building, peacemaking and conflict avoidance and resolution. It is in many ways a profession for the ages. So here the important word is peacemaking and conflict avoidance and resolution. So she says that it is such a peaceful it has a peaceful objective, and it is a fine art, and it is needed in the world for us to live in peace. Okay, now coming to the next part is: how old is this institution? Where do we trace its origins? So in this, I would like to tell all of you that diplomacy, if we trace back the history, we have to say it is as old as human civilization. It can be traced to antiquity, because even even the most ancient and primitive societies required some form of communication and dealing with the neighbors. So if you imagine a state or a state of nature where humans have just settled down in their agricultural colonies and they are the tribal system, so even diplomacy was required even then for one tribe to be able to communicate with other tribe without involving itself in war. So that even then diplomacy was used. Okay, so it is as old as human civilization. That is the important point. So from then we go to Ernest Sato's, what he has written. He was also a British diplomat and scholar who has written this very famous book titled A Guide to Diplomatic Practice. And he has written that the earliest known diplomatic document is actually found in modern day Syria, and it was found by an Italian archaeologist team in 1972. And this document is actually a cuneiform tablet. Cuneiform is clay tablet where it was inscribed. There is inscription on the clay tablet, and in that there is a letter, and this letter is from the Mesopotamian kingdom of Ebla to that of Amazi, which was another kingdom at that point of time, which is around 1,000 kilometers away. And this, letter on that cuneiform tablet talked about, exchange of horse chariots between the two kingdoms. So this is the earliest evidence or the earliest record of diplomatic document that we find. And at this time, so this is around 2500 BC. So at this point of time in India, if you all think about it, at this point of time we have the Harappan civilization or the Indus Valley civilization in India at this point of time, and the script of the Harappan civilization has not been deciphered, and maybe when it is deciphered we will get to know that it contains a trove for diplomatic archives and diplomacy at that point of time. And there have been a lot of mentioning of diplomacy even in the Rig Veda, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata. And in the Ramayana, we have an instance where Ravana wanted to put Lord Hanuman, who was the messenger of Lord Rama, to death, but he was advised by Bibhisana on the contrary, because he said that killing a messenger would actually go against dharma. So we have mentions of diplomatic immunity and protecting messengers of diplomacy even in our Vedas, even in our Vedas. So that means this institution of diplomacy is as old as human civilization. Now, coming to a brief overview of the evolution of diplomacy. Now, this is just a brief overview because I have just written about the watershed or turning points of diplomacy, where certain practices in diplomatic practice were institutionalized during these turning points. Now, so as we know that, diplomacy evolved, the institution of diplomacy has evolved with evolving changes in the context, in the overall context of human existence. So, for example, in the definition of diplomacy, we said that it was peaceful conduct of relations among political entities. Now, the nature of these political entities that are conducting diplomacy has also changed, as I already mentioned. So, these entities have evolved throughout our am I audible? Yes, Gazala, you are audible, but I think someone else is presenting. Okay, so yeah, so I was going into how the nature of these political entities that are conducting diplomacy have also evolved, and so we have from tribal existence. So from tribal existence, we have towards
I'm so sorry, Gazala. Pooja Mishra, please switch off your mic. I don't have the. Otherwise, I will remove you from your. I'm sorry. Gazala, please, I'm sorry, continue.
Okay, it's okay. Yeah. So these political entities, the nature of these entities have also evolved. So initially we had the tribal groupings, and then we move on to empires, and now after the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, we are living in the state system. So firstly, this major change of the political entities conducting diplomacy. Now, I want to start with focusing on ancient Greek diplomacy, which functioned in the 4th to 5th century BC. And the most important aspect of this ancient Greek diplomacy was its open nature. So the diplomats were chosen in ancient Greece on a ad hoc basis, and a large number of diplomats were chosen to represent their countries. But diplomacy took place in an open environment, and it was required that all the diplomats that were sent to foreign countries, to other countries, had very good oratory skills, so that they could sway public opinion in their favor in those countries. Now, this is in contrast to what we experience diplomacy as today, because if you see, most of the diplomacy that we have right now takes place behind closed doors, and the normal public does not know कि negotiations के अंदर क्या हुआ है, क्या नहीं हुआ, हमें नहीं पता चलता है. So you know that closed and open. So ancient Greek the focus was on open diplomacy. Then we come to the Byzantine Empire, or what is also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, which was there during the from 4th to 15th century AD. Before that, I just want to focus during the ancient Greek timing. At that point of time, in India, we had the rule of the Mauryan dynasty, and Mauryan dynasty is Chandragupta Maurya and his successors is famous for also the expert advice given by Chanakya or Kautilya. And we all know the 4 principles of diplomatic and conflict resolution policies that he had given. First of Sam, what is known as Sam, Dam, Danda and Bhed. So Sam is basically negotiation, Dam is bribery, then Bhed is influencing the mind by trickery, and lastly Danda, which means the use of force. So we are familiar with, at this point of time, what is happening on India's, on the eastern side of the world also. Now coming to the Byzantine Empire, or also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, the important thing here is that this empire institutionalized the training of diplomatic envoys. So till now, there was no formal induction of people into the service and their training. But this is the empire that is started training their diplomatic envoys. Next, we come to the papal diplomacy, or the diplomacy conducted during the medieval times in Europe, and they excelled in record keeping of diplomatic records. So they had this huge documents where they used to keep the records. So they started. So first you have the training of diplomats by the Byzantine Empire. Then papal diplomacy started record keeping. Then we come to the Italian city-states in the 15th century. And for Italian city-states, the most important thing that they began in this evolution of diplomacy is the institution of resident embassies. Because till now, you only had ambassadors or diplomats going abroad, staying there for some time, coming back as messengers to and fro. They used to go to and fro. But then having an embassy established there in the foreign land was started during the Italian city-states in the 15th century. So what we witness today, like India has embassies abroad, and so many countries have their embassies in India, in New Delhi and other places. So that was started during, it can be traced back to this Italian city-states in the 15th century. Now, coming to the codification of the formal diplomatic processes, the diplomatic immunity, and all of these areas that took place in the Congress of Vienna from 1814 to 1815, where the diplomatic rules and procedures were decided upon by the major European powers. Now, these rules got formal acknowledgement by most of the states with the formal institutionalization of the Vienna Convention of Diplomatic Affairs of 1961, which is an international treaty that lays down the legal basis for diplomatic immunity. And diplomatic immunity basically means that no harm is supposed to be done to the messenger from outside, to an ambassador, no harm, and that ambassador should be able, he or she should be able to conduct his negotiation in a free and fair manner. That is the meaning of diplomatic immunity. So this Vienna Convention codifies diplomatic immunity. It codifies, what is the process of how should ambassadors present their credentials, what should be the way of functioning. It provides a kind of framework for the diplomatic practice overall. So this has been a brief overview of the evolution of diplomacy so far. Now the next important thing that was a watershed in the, that became a watershed or a major turning point in the diplomatic practice is the information and communications revolution. Now, the most important change in diplomatic practice, as I've already mentioned, has been brought about by this revolution. Now, this impacted the practice and theory of diplomacy in several fronts. Now, why did this ICT revolution impact us? Like, even if we think about it, our personal lives have also been impacted by it, right? So, our parents' generation did not have in their time mobile phones, or did not have the cable TV, Tata Sky, or did not have the wherewithal to travel so freely outside by train. So, sending messages, the internet, the World Wide Web. So, all these things, this information and communications technology revolution has impacted all facets of our life, and similarly it has impacted the diplomatic realm also. And why it has impacted the diplomatic realm so much is because the foundation of diplomacy is communications and negotiations. So the whole thing of communications has been impacted by this revolution, and it has made it very fast-paced by these technologies. So earlier, the diplomats posted in foreign locations had to wait for their diplomatic bags to come through ship, and then they had to write letters, put it back in the diplomatic bag, send it through ship. So the entire communication process of these ambassadors outside, their information, the process of information exchange between the home state and the ambassadors posted in foreign states, the entire time period used to take very, very long. So that impacted policy making, that impacted the length of the time taken to make policy. But that has become compressed now because of the revolution in ICT, and the diplomacy, it has impacted diplomacy because it has made it very, very fast paced. Okay, now this entire change in the practice has impacted the discourse of diplomacy or the theory of diplomacy. And these days we have new types of diplomacy that we talk about, like rapid reaction diplomacy, media diplomacy, digital diplomacy, public diplomacy. So there were new terms that were brought about because of this ICT revolution. So rapid reaction diplomacy, to explain in a brief way, is basically fast-paced diplomacy, as I've already mentioned. Media diplomacy is where officials use the media to communicate with others and change the perception of the public. That is media diplomacy. And we see that, leaders all over the world have been using media diplomacy to communicate with the public or to communicate with foreign governments also to change their perception. Then the third thing is digital diplomacy, where if the students here are active on Twitter, you will see that most of the foreign ambassadors in India, or most of our embassies, they have their own Twitter handle. So they have their own, and this was actually brought to the public and became very famous during the time of Sushma Swaraj, who reached out to Indians in distress abroad and personally saw that they were rescued, and she reached out to the public, and by using the medium of Twitter, she earned a lot of respect and love, and for using technology to make diplomacy and consular services accessible to the public. And recently you must have seen that India's ambassador to France, Mr. Javed Ashraf, also tweeted about how the France was delivering the 5 Rafale fighter jets from France to India. And he tweeted, in his tweet he had mentioned that this is not only will add to our air power, but it also shows the strategic partnership between France and India. So this message there was not only for the home public, Indian public, but it was also a message for the public of France or the French leadership, that we value this relationship. So digital diplomacy is very, very important in today's times. Then we come to public diplomacy. Now, public diplomacy is where the government of a particular country is reaching out to the public in a foreign land. So if you look at traditional diplomacy is where basically a government of a particular country is talking to the government of another country. Say Ministry of External Affairs India is having negotiations with the Ministry of External Affairs Pakistan, Bangladesh, or the United States State Department. So it's government to government, G to G. Okay, but when the government of a particular country or the Ministry of External Affairs goes and directly communicates with the public of a foreign country, that is known as public diplomacy, which is G to P, government to public. And the whole logic behind the government having negotiations or kind of influencing the mind of public in a foreign land is that it is said, the logic is that in a democratic form, in a democratic setup, if you influence the mind of people or if you influence public opinion, then that public opinion can then influence foreign policy in a democracy. So that is the logic. Now, on these 4 types of diplomacy, new types of diplomacy that we have talked about, that is possible only because of this ICT revolution. So coming to the last slide. The last slide is the impact of COVID-19 and its impact. Now, COVID-19 pandemic, as we know, has become a watershed in all aspects of our lives. Now, the important question to ask is, what impact has it had in the practice of diplomacy? Now, something that has been observed by everybody right now is that it has exacerbated or it has increased the virtual element of diplomatic practice. So what we saw with the ICT revolution and the coming up of all these new types of diplomacy, that aspect has been amplified and exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And the virtual, so what is become very predominant now, and that is virtual diplomacy has become very, very predominant. And you see that, earlier on diplomacy, whenever foreign visit used to happen, or diplomacy used to be conducted with conferences, multilateral conferences, or Prime Minister Modi visiting to so many countries, and the scenic photo shoots that we see, and they have all come to a standstill because of the pandemic. We don't have any more foreign leaders freely traveling to other countries for various conferences. That has become to a standstill. Now the virus, it can be said that the virus has brought to a halt what is known as face-to-face diplomacy. Now, face-to-face diplomacy or interpersonal diplomacy is very important in the field of diplomacy, because face-to-face, what happens in a face-to-face conversation is that you build a certain rapport. You see the expression of the other person. You accordingly change your dialogue, or the way of talking, or the tone, or the tenor. Now all that is not possible, so much possible in a virtual setup. And so this face-to-face diplomacy is also very important to maintain lasting relationship, to build friendship and lasting relationship, which cannot be done in virtual diplomacy so much. But we have seen that with COVID-19, the virtual diplomacy is so predominant, and all these face-to-face diplomacy has come to a standstill. And some examples of this virtual diplomacy are how the SARC meeting in March was held virtually. The G20 meeting in March was also held virtually. The non-alignment summit in May was also held virtually. In fact, Prime Minister Modi also gave a video conferencing with the heads of India's missions worldwide. So that was also done in a virtual manner. The meetings of the United Nations Security Council is conducted virtually. The European Union is meeting virtually. NATO. So everything has moved on to the virtual setup. Now there are certain merits and demerits of virtual diplomacy. Now what are the benefits or the merits of virtual diplomacy? The first benefit would be that it is cost cutting. So when our foreign leaders are no longer traveling with huge missions and their own aircraft carriers, so it reduces the cost of diplomacy. That is the first benefit or the merit. The second merit is that diplomacy, there is a openness or transparency attached to virtual diplomacy, because if the meetings can be streamlined, specifically multilateral meetings of the UN or multilateral meetings or other conferences, if it can be streamlined to the public, then it leads to a transparency in diplomacy. So that can be another merit of virtual diplomacy. However, there are also demerits or challenges to virtual diplomacy, and the first challenge would be that of cyber insecurity. Because right now, this whole setup of hacking of this website by a certain group, hacking of that website, or even in our personal conversations, sometimes we say, no, oh, Google hears everything, don't mention in front of Google, or don't speak loudly when your phone is near, you never know who might be listening. And so all of that thing. So before a conference is held, the entire face-to-face conference, the entire area is sanitized, and all the bugs are checked, whether there are any bugs, whether there are any microphones attached or whatever. But that is not possible when you're holding a meeting, say on a Google Meet or Zoom platform, because you never know who is listening to the conversation. And in a diplomatic negotiation, sensitive information, very, very sensitive and secret information is passed out between one country and another country. But knowing that other people might be hearing into this conversation, the diplomats themselves become inhibited. Like they themselves cannot talk freely, because who knows who is listening to the conversation. So that is the cyber insecurity and hacking problem might be there. And the other thing of virtual diplomacy is that the area of misinformation. Because right now, even in politics, for every news item that we get, we have to fact check it. We have to check what is the source of this information, where it is coming from, whether this is true or not. So it is already like, we are living in a post-truth world. So in that kind of setup, there is a lot of scope for misinformation. So when there is misinformation, it presents a challenge to virtual diplomacy, because you don't know what happened in the meeting and what is being said by the media. As Dr. Ball also said, that do not believe the media and what it says. So that is another challenge of virtual diplomacy. So in conclusion, I would like to say that the evolutionary process of diplomacy that we have dealt with, the COVID-19 compulsions have made diplomacy move to a virtual level. Okay, but will this virtual diplomacy be an everlasting feature of the diplomatic practice? Will it be as predominant when the COVID is over? Or will it subside? Will it subside? This virtual element of diplomacy, will it subside? And I want the students to think about whether they find this virtual diplomacy viable, or is it important? Is it not important? Should it do after the COVID-19 pandemic is over? Should it continue? Should it not continue? Because when the pandemic hit us, virtual diplomacy filled kind of a vacuum. A vacuum had been created in the diplomatic realm, which had to be filled, because this was the time when countries needed to act together more so than ever before. So the virtual diplomacy provided a kind of a space filler, it filled the vacuum, which was very, very important. However, can such meetings replace traditional diplomacy or face-to-face diplomacy? According to me, it cannot replace face-to-face diplomacy, because the kind of relationships that are formed in face-to-face negotiations, the same kind of relationships and lasting friendships cannot be formed in virtual diplomacy. And the other feature of virtual diplomacy that is really good for researchers and for everybody else, for the public, is that it tends to make the diplomatic practice, which is usually inside a black box, that it makes it more transparent for people like us who study diplomacy, and also students of foreign policy and diplomacy who are interested in what is going around in the foreign policy domain, in the diplomatic domain. So that is the merits of virtual diplomacy, but it cannot replace face-to-face diplomacy. So I thank you, and I'm looking forward to the question answer session.
Thank you so much, Gazala, for your presentation. It was a very comprehensive session, and I'm sure the students enjoyed the lecture. Let's go ahead with the questions.
Priyanka?
Yes, sir.
Yes, just I would like to tell one point.
Yes.
Dr. Gazala, for a brilliant exposition of the concept of diplomacy, and she started brilliantly from the time when the concept of diplomacy has originated and to the present context. Now, in a lighter mood, I would like to add 2 points. First point, the face-to-face diplomacy. We have seen the effect of face-to-face diplomacy when Trump was allowed to come in on 14th of March, when already the WHO has declared that a pandemic, the COVID-19 situation, a pandemic one. Even then, Trump was allowed to come in Ahmedabad to meet with Modi, his friend, great friend. And that was the cause why, that was the reason why this coronavirus affected the people of Ahmedabad so much. This is number one. And this has also been mentioned by Gazala, that this is also saved a lot from our exchequer, because we know that since 2014 up to 2019, Modi and his group, they traveled so many places of the world. But because of this pandemic, since the March 2020, it has been totally stopped. So it has contributed a lot to our exchequer. So these are also in a very lighter mood, not in a serious mood, in which Gazala has discussed. But I just wanted to add these 2 points because it came to my mind. But otherwise, the exposition is very brilliant, and I hope that our students would be immensely benefited by her exposition, like the presentation made by Aditya Hussain yesterday also. So thanks to both of you on my part and on behalf of our college and also on behalf of our department. So Priyanka, you can carry on now.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
There are two students who want you to highlight the definition of diplomatic realm once again because they are saying that they missed it because of some network issues. So, if you could please. The
Okay, so diplomatic realm. So diplomacy is basically.
Just on 1 minute. Priyanka, you follow the questions one by one, okay? From
yes,
top
sir.
to okay?
Yes, yes, sir.
So that all the questions could be raised. Okay.
Yes, sir.
So diplomatic realm is basically right now, if we look at it, diplomacy means the relationship of political entities, a peaceful relationship between political entities. So diplomacy, is usually traditional diplomacy, or what is known as the diplomatic realm is usually when two countries or relationship between nation states. But right now there has been a broadening and deepening of this diplomatic realm, which was basically a relationship between various states. There are other non-state actors and both below and above that have also entered this diplomatic realm. So for example, United Nations at the top here, United Nations or the European Union or international non-governmental organizations are here. At the same time, within the domestic realm, so within India, you have the West Bengal government separately negotiating with the government of Bangladesh, or having a say in the Tista water sharing this thing, or the Sri Lankan population or the Tamil Nadu population having a say in the in what goes around, or in what happens with Sri Lanka. So this whole diplomatic realm that is there, initially it was meant to be only nation states, the relationship between states, but right now there are a whole lot of other actors that are also present in this realm of diplomacy, both above the nation states and below the nation states.
Thank you. There is another question by Karuna Dahal. She is a third year student, and she is saying that her question is: there is a change in diplomacy due to COVID-19. To what extent will it affect India and its diplomats in carrying its diplomacy with other countries? Will it be challenging?
Yes, of course, there has been a change in diplomacy. As I mentioned already, that we have moved to the virtual realm right now. But Indian diplomacy so far has been keeping up pace, I would say, because as Sir was also mentioning, Dr. Ball was also mentioning, this whole thing of medical diplomacy has been vigorously pursued by India, and India has in fact supplied farmer commodities to 85 plus countries till now. And the whole this Vande Bharat mission, when we sent our planes to get Indians stuck abroad, or even if you look at so the diplomacy has been pursued vigorously by India, be it the setting up of the SARC fund by India. So despite the challenges that COVID-19 has placed upon diplomacy, I think Indian diplomacy has managed quite well even in such challenging times.
Now, the other question is from Abhishek Prasad. So he has 4 questions. Firstly, how far digital diplomacy is effective in comparison to the physical presence, face-to-face diplomacy in COVID-19 era? The second question is, why is USA and Russia looking towards India as to be in the United Nations Security Council permanent member, and how far will it be helpful to India? Will it be beneficial? The third question is, do you agree that China's One Belt, One Road policy as economic diplomacy, and should India join it? And the fourth question is, should India go ahead from NAM policy in the China active expansion policy era?
Thank you, Abhishek Prasad, for these four questions. With regard to the four question, I have already, with regard to whether digital diplomacy is effective in comparison to physical presence diplomacy, I would say that although, as I mentioned in the conclusion, that although it has filled up the space that was created due to the pandemic, but it cannot replace physical diplomacy or face-to-face diplomacy. At best, it can substitute. At best, it can. What's the word for it? It can be an addition. It can be an addition, but it cannot replace it. That is the first question. And the India's seat at the United Nations Security Council, I think it is justified that with the changing global order right now, the United Nations Security Council should reflect the changing global order that is there, with the power dynamics that has been changing. So India, as the emerging power, should be given a seat in the United Nations Security Council, and we should definitely pursue this vigorously, this membership in the. And right now, I think we have just become a non-permanent member of the Security Council for the 8th time, and this is a very opportune moment for India to pursue its membership in the. But there are a lot of problems attached to this UNSC membership, but I'm sure Indian diplomats would pursue it to their best. And China's One Belt, One Road policy, we did not join the One Belt, One Road policy because it had a territory that belonged to India that is now. It went through one of the disputed territories. So citing that, we did not join the One Belt, One Road. But considering the larger geopolitics situation, I think India should not. And this I want to relate with your last question. That should India go ahead from NAM policy in the China active. So, with regard to the larger geopolitics where China is rising, and we see that the US is a declining power and China is a rising power. Now, during the Cold War time, when US was at the helm of affairs, and that point of time, we espoused this very wonderful policy of non-alignment movement, where we said that we are not attached with either of the power blocks, and we will pursue an independent foreign policy, and we will pursue what is known as strategic autonomy. And this strategic autonomy should be there right now also, whether China is rising, not rising. But as we see that there is a tilt in Indian foreign policy towards the US, which I think is wrong, because US is a declining power, which is hurting our relationship with the other coalition of countries that are coming together on the eastern side. So we should play it very safe right now and maintain this excellent strategic autonomy that we have upholded so far with so much vigor. We should maintain it. So the next question.
You can pick up the questions yourself, Satya,
Okay, so the next question is by Bharti Chaudhary, who says, what are the key differences between government public diplomacy and non-state public diplomacy? So government, there is this whole debate that is there, whether anything to do with diplomacy can be non-state or not. Say, for example, even for public diplomacy, it is usually not, there is this thing of public to public relationship is also there in the discourse, where we say that the public of a particular country is reaching out to the public of a foreign country, and they are having interpersonal or interconnections between them, like in the case of India and Nepal. But whether, without the government support or government authorization, if all these linkages, whether these informal linkages, whether that can be tagged as diplomacy or not, it is still debatable. So what public diplomacy essentially means, that the government has to be present in any form of, if it has to be tagged as diplomacy, it has to be, the government has to be present. So in the case of, say, for example, track 2 diplomacy, track 2 diplomacy is non-state actors conducting diplomacy, but these non-state actors have some form of back channel, government backing. That is there, or the retired foreign service people are in track 2 diplomacy. They have some kind of legitimacy. Now, without this government legitimacy, groups of people, maintaining their linkages, whether that can be tagged as diplomacy or not is still debatable. Now, how can we make, this is by Sen Atul, ki digital diplomacy in Indian government. Digital diplomacy by the Indian government has been, done since 2010. So vigorously pursued since 2010. In fact, even before that, since the year 2006, when we established the public diplomacy division in the Ministry of External Affairs, and then we have Navdeep Suri, who established the digital domain and pursued it vigorously. From then on, we have Twitter account handles and Facebook and YouTube channel for so digital diplomacy was picked up very, and the Ministry of External Affairs even got an award for digital diplomacy from the government. And virtual diplomacy, this is the question by Sandeep Prasad, who says that virtual diplomacy must be there, but it should be at least, yes, it cannot be similar to face-to-face diplomacy. I totally agree with Sandeep Prasad, who says that virtual diplomacy should be present, but it cannot replace face-to-face diplomacy. And the question by Shushmita Saha is, can media diplomacy be always correct? I would say that media diplomacy can sometimes go horribly wrong, because sometimes, leaders who do not have that much political maturity can make offhand remarks that does not go down well with the foreign audience or the foreign leaders. And so governments using the media to pass on a message, especially with immature political leadership, can go horribly wrong. And the best example would would be Donald Trump, who makes all kinds of non-serious comments on Twitter, which hurts the diplomacy of the US. The next question is by DK Roy, who says, in this COVID era, what can be the opportunities and challenges for India's diplomacy? So the opportunities and challenges. So the opportunities is that for Indian diplomacy, since a pharmaceutical company, India has one of the largest pharma producers. So we can use medical diplomacy in a very, very good way. And in fact, we have already got the Serum Institute of India has already got the what do you call that? It has already got the making of the vaccine, right? So it has already got that. So this has to be pursued very vigorously by Indian diplomats. And challenges is that COVID-19 has presented for Indian diplomacy is, the most important COVID-19, although it's not related to the pandemic, but as Professor Dept has been mentioning, that our relationship has been getting spoiled with the rest of the neighborhood for various reasons, domestic reasons and other reasons. So that is a challenge for diplomacy right now, because most of our neighbors that are there has been hurt by some of the statements that are made, or the domestic reasons that we have cited for certain policies that we have adopted. The next question is by Ritam Das, who says that as we know that the diplomats are the eyes and ears of the government, but the present pandemic situation, diplomatic relation has been virtual. Does this virtual diplomacy affect the country's security policy? What could be the suggestive alternatives rather than conducting virtual programs? And the other question is media diplomacy. Priyanka, I'll just read all the questions once now, because I think they are interrelated.
Yeah.
Okay.
You do whatever you feel comfortable.
So to answer Ritan Das, who says that diplomats are the eyes and ears of the government, and so everything has become virtual right now, and because of the pandemic. So that, in spite and despite of the pandemic, because we live in a age of information, I think to say that diplomats are the sole eyes and ears of the government is not totally correct, because the government already gets a lot of information from other sources. So this function of the diplomat, of the eyes and ears of the government, is has changed. It is not necessarily true as of the moment, but what diplomats do is that among all this information that is there in the realm, in the huge realm, they focus or they streamline this information and present it to the government. So the information is already there, but who will make sense of the information? And this sense of the information, this sense, making sense of this vast amount of information that is there, along with their diplomatic experience, or their or what they have gained by interacting with the people in the host countries, or what information they are getting from the local people there, or from their elite people there, or all the meetings that they hold there. So that information together, put with this information from this realm, they make sense of that and they present to the government. So that function is still very important for diplomats, making sense of this vast amount of information that is there. The next question is by Surya Das, who says, my question is, can media diplomacy and digital diplomacy always be correct? No, as I already mentioned, that digital, you always have to look at the source of the information. So if it is by a verified Twitter account of an ambassador, then we must take it on face value. We must take it as, yes, it is a verified account. But if it is being excuse me, passed around by an unverified account, then we should recheck the fact, recheck it, whether this is really being said, because as I said, that we live in an age where there is fake news being passed around as if it's the truth. So we always have to verify, and digital diplomacy and media diplomacy, if not used properly, can go horribly wrong also. And the next question is by Amit Das, who says, what is the relationship between foreign policy and diplomacy? Now, there is a saying, I'm forgetting who exactly it is said by, but it says that what tactics is to strategy, diplomacy is to foreign policy. So if foreign policy and strategy is like a larger policy that the government has, okay, our relationship with China has to be a certain way, or our foreign policy towards the neighborhood has to be a certain way. Now the policy is there. The implementing of that policy, the implementation part, that is diplomacy. So when you are implementing that foreign policy, that is called diplomacy. So for example, with strategy and taxes, so strategy is like a long-term strategy, right? Long-term plan. It's like a policy. And tactics is that small, small steps that you take to fulfill that strategy. So similarly, foreign policy is a larger domain, and diplomacy is the small steps you take to fulfill that foreign policy. The next question is by Susmita Saha, who says, how will India's relationship with China play out in the post-COVID-19 times? I'm not I have to read on the issue, but I would still say that we have to, with China, the saying, I think by Prime Minister Modi's goes something like, na aap dikhayenge na aap jhukhayenge. So basically, because they are being aggressive, we cannot back out, because backing out cannot be done, because it is matters of our national interest and matters of our territory. But at the same point of time, we should not be over ambitious or over aggressive, that war ensues. So we have to play it very, very to use the word strategically and diplomatically, and avoiding war, we have to take care of our interest with China. With regard to Komal Chaudhary, who says that, is there a similar difference between diplomacy and international politics? Should we differentiate between international politics and diplomacy? Yes, international politics is a very, very huge realm, and diplomacy is just a part of this entire gamut of international politics. And and it's a very, very important realm, because the whole international politics domain is run, it's like the same difference that I mentioned between foreign policy and diplomacy. So international politics is a huge realm, and diplomacy is a part that that implements that works out the international politics domain. Diplomacy functions. So Ritan Das says, we know that diplomatic functions in three aspects: intelligence sharing, image management, policy implementation. Does this virtualization of diplomatic policies will harm any of these concepts? With regard to intelligence sharing, the virtualization will definitely be a challenge, because even in medieval times, when it used to be, information used to be passed by form of the telegraph, the diplomats had to decipher their various codes, so different codes. They had to have a kind of a language of their own, so that if that telegraph was intercepted by a foreign country, they would not be able to understand what was being said. So similarly, I think in intelligence sharing, the whole virtualization presents a very, very, it presents a challenging aspect. With regard to image management, I think virtualization has to be used for image management, and this is being done by India, as I've already mentioned, with its diplomacy, it is called Twitter diplomacy or diplomacy. So image management is being done. And policy implementation, of course, virtualization is a part, but the policy implementation has to be done at the ground level. It cannot be done virtually. Virtually, of course, you can hold meetings and you can prepare policy briefs, but whatever the policy is there, say suppose you have to have like what Mr. Kissing was mentioning yesterday, right? You can sign it. It's not just about rhetorics, but it is about implementing it on the ground. So same thing, you can hold a virtual meeting and sign an agreement, but whatever is written in the meeting, it has to be implemented on the ground. So that is there. And okay. UNO's membership should increase. Yes, definitely it should increase in the Security Council, because it has to reflect the power representations in the world right now. And Diman Malakar is asking, what is digital diplomacy and media diplomacy? So media diplomacy, as I told you, is when officials in the government are using the media to pass on a message to the government of a foreign country, or to the government, or to the people of a foreign country, or even to the people of their own country. So that is media diplomacy. Digital diplomacy is whatever happens in the digital domain, like all these virtual conferences or the e-summits, or using social media platforms. That is known as digital diplomacy. So the last question, I think, is by Mr. Chakravarti, who says that, in my observation, digital diplomacy falls under the broad spectrum of public diplomacy, the roots of which can be traced to the extensive use of radio communication by both the Axis and the Allied powers during World War II. Interestingly, the digitization of diplomacy, however, is believed to have happened earlier, when foreign ministries began using the telegraph services in the 19th century. In contemporary context, digital diplomacy has been practiced primarily through social media. So I think in this question, actually in social sciences, we have, if you've read, if there's this article by Quinton Skinner, who talks about the mythology of doctrine and mythology of coherence. And in mythology of doctrine, He says that, you know, most of the times in social sciences, what we end up doing is that we create new terms like, you know, digital diplomacy or public diplomacy, and so it's a new term for us, and then we trace it. We've created it right now, this term, but we trace the history back and said that, okay, you know, at this point of time also we were practicing what is known as digital diplomacy. So that might not, such an understanding for social sciences might not be totally correct, because it's a new term. So to put everything in the past with the benefit of the hindsight that we have right now, to categorize things that have happened in the past in the new terminologies of today can be a bit problematic. But I do agree with you that, you know, digital diplomacy and public diplomacy are related, and in fact public diplomacy is a broader domain, and because and digital diplomacy falls under that but it might be treated as separate categories also, both these domains, but it might be treated as helping each other also. Because public diplomacy, of course, it is came up during the Cold War time, when the United States had their public diplomacy division established to fight the communism that was being spread by the USSR. So it had its origins there, and in fact, India also. It is said that during the 1971 war, Indira Gandhi effectively used what is now we known as public diplomacy when she gave interviews to the BBC and to radio channels as to why India was intervening in the war. So that is there. So both are subsets of each other, but can be treated as separately also. And yeah, I think I'm done with all the questions, Priyanka. If have I missed anything?
No, I think that is it. Thank you, Gazala.
Okay, good afternoon. Priyanka, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Good afternoon. I, Bhavita Das, on behalf of the fraternity of the Department of Political Science of Mahavidyalaya, would like to take this opportunity to thank Ms. Gazala Fareedi, an assistant professor at Southfield College under ABU, for a wonderful speech on diplomacy and its evolution in the era of COVID-19. This discussion has opened a new panorama of views of foreign policy, because diplomacy is also an important instrument of foreign policy. It would be very useful for our students in better understanding of diplomacy. Hope so the students enjoy this invited lecture. I extend my gratitude to our venerated principal sir, Dr. Punab Kumar Mishra, for giving us an opportunity to conduct such an event. I also shower my heartiest regard to the IQAC coordinator, Dr. Arnob Gaur, for assisting and be with us as a helping hand in time we need. Next, my dear students, who remain composed and calm during this lecture, and I extend my love and thanks, and you all have told that there is so much to learn when you just listen. Last but not least, I thank my dear colleague. Without your sincere cooperation, an event like this could never have taken place. What's the word?
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gazala. We can end the session now. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, thank you so much to Surya Mahavidyalaya and to Priyanka and to Dr. Das and to Professor Dev and to Dr. Chakravarti and to Dr. Ball and to the students, and for asking such excellent questions, and I really enjoyed interacting with you all, and it was a really good session. Thank you so much.
Okay. Okay, thanks to all our students also. who participated very eagerly, and all of whom tried to understand what has been delivered by both Aditya and Gazala, and raises so many questions that prove their involvement with the program. So I hope, as they have been praised, the students of our department, they are taking part in all the activities, and they have been very rightly praised by the IPSC coordinator. So we hope that we would take up some other program with them, because we don't know when the actual classes will be started. So we have to take this kind of activities further, and I hope in future also we will be getting Gazala and Aditya, while we would ask them to join in some interactive courses. Okay, thanks to all, and my gratitude to Priyanka for arranging all these things. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. We can all leave the meeting now. Thank you.